I've been with Scott before, I've seen Scott speak. Scott's been around here quite a long time, our regional biologist for the WDFW, and works on a lot of large critters, mostly carnivores, and deer a lot, but he is a herpophile, a herper. He loves them. So have you got to do some of this for real work? Yeah, but a lot of it is just your personal passion and hobby. So he's going to cover certainly all the reptiles in the Methow tonight, and then we'll get a little bit of information on some other reptiles in the state as well. Thank you, Scott.
Sure. I know most of you here. As a district biologist, as Mary said, I work on a lot of different things, but since I can remember as a little kid, herbs fascinated me, and I spent countless hours running around the woods catching them. I couldn't tell you how many rough-skinned newts I grabbed as a kid, and I'm still here, so I can't grab it. Tonight, I just want to kind of give you a more maybe in-depth and up-close and personal look at the critters that we have here locally, so that when you're out and about, you know a little bit more about them and maybe be a little more engaged and apt to maybe even pick one up to really have a good close look at it. It was really great that Dan brought all those live critters last week. It's a really hard act to follow, but I'm glad that you had the opportunity to see those animals and in many cases touch them. I don't know, I never pass up the opportunity to handle herbs, so. Yeah. Alrighty, here's our valley. This photograph is actually taken from a location that's important for one of our local critters, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So here's not all, but a subsampling of some of our local cast of characters in the reptile world. All three orders represented there: the turtles, the lizards, and the snakes. But just from that one slide, you get a sense for the diversity, both in terms of their shape, their color, maybe even where they live a little bit. And again, we're talking about reptiles, the class Reptilia. And there's four major groups. You got the snakes, you got the turtles, which include the sea turtles. We tend to forget about those sometimes. The crocodilians, and then the lizards. And as Dan pointed out last time, lizards and snakes are pretty closely related. They're actually in the same order. They're in different suborders. I think sometimes we forget about that just because they look so different. Oh, and I wanted to mention, so to the extent I could, I used local slides as much as possible in this show, so the pictures you're going to see of these critters are from animals that were actually here in the valley, by and large. Obviously that crocodile wasn't, but and actually none of these four were, because this is a more generalized slide. But when we get to the individual species, the pictures will be local, and so it'll give you a better idea of what these animals look like here in the valley. Because some of these species vary a lot in color across their range. So just kind of a review a little bit about, okay, what makes a reptile? Well, they're ectothermic. We talked at length about that last week, so I won't go into that too much. Dry, scaly skin, that's kind of important to remember when, during your next talk, you're talking about amphibians, which do not have dry, scaly skin. So that's an important difference. They all have lungs. Not all amphibians have lungs. Dan mentioned that last week as well. But all reptiles do. They also have internal fertilization, unlike most of the amphibians. And they have shelled amniotic eggs. They don't always lay those eggs externally, but they do produce them, at least inside their body. And that's important because it means they're not dependent on water like the amphibians that you'll talk about next week are. All right, so I have to give a nod out to John Rohr during this talk, because I've stolen a bunch of material that he often uses in some of his talks. And one of the things he likes to do is compare what we have here locally with another part of the country where herbs are much more abundant. And in this case, that's Tucson, Arizona. John grew up in Arizona, so he has an affinity for that part of the world. And in Tucson, within a 100-mile radius of Tucson, you have 6 turtle, tortoise species, 45 lizards, 51 snakes, and 12 different rattlesnake species. That's more, the 12 rattlesnake species is more than the number of snakes and lizards we have combined here in the Methow. So Because we're far north and colder climate, our cast of characters is fairly limited. But the ones we do have are pretty interesting. I think every one of them's got something, and I've got a slide for each that I call cool facts. That's kind of, if not unique, just something that's really, in my opinion anyway, pretty intriguing about each one of these. There's the list. It's not real big. The ones with question marks we'll touch on at the very end of the talk. I suspect they occur here. We just haven't documented them, and maybe that's a challenge for all of you to go out and find one of those two. So first up, and I should say, I can sometimes talk too long to a fault. I'm going to try not to do that. And so this presentation shouldn't be super long, so there's plenty of time for questions. If you want to interrupt me, feel free. Yeah?
What's winter? What's temperature for your winter? When does winter occur?
For here locally? That's
No,
good.
for these species.
Right. It varies on the individual species, but to generalize, I would say winter starts for most of our reptiles. Well, the lizard's probably earlier than the snake, so sometime in September, middle to late September. Some of the snakes are out later in the middle of October or beyond. The turtles are active even later than that until the ice covers the pond, so it varies. And in the spring, it's kind of the reverse. As the ice comes off the ponds, the turtles, then the snakes, then the lizards. Oh, let me back up. So turtles, so how do you know you have a turtle? This is fairly obvious. It's got its shell, that's kind of its signature feature. And that shell's really there as a protection security device. It can hold its head and feet in and be fairly well protected from predation that way. And one of the really interesting things about turtles is turtles and tortoises in general are super long-lived. So some of the larger tortoise species, they believe can live up to 200 years, which is kind of staggering when you think about it. Turtles, and maybe this is something that's new to some of you, they all lay eggs, but they lay them on land. They don't lay them in the water. You know, I think of turtles as being pretty aquatic, but they've got to come onto the land to lay eggs. Alrighty, here's another fun thing that John likes to do is give you some terms you can impress your friends with later. So the top part of a turtle that is called a carapace, that's the upper shell. The bottom part's called a plastron. Hemidid, that's a term that means semi-aquatic, and that's kind of what turtles are. You know, they're in the water feeding quite often, and then they're up on the land to lay eggs and bask and do other things. Some of us are fairly hemidid in the summer, I would argue. You know, we're in and out of the water quite a bit. And depauperate, that's, you know, the lack of diversity in our Methow turtle species. And let's talk about turtle diversity more specifically. So worldwide, there's quite a few, 257, give or take, probably. There's 6 species within the Tucson circle. You know, you don't think again about maybe Tucson being really dry, maybe there's not a lot of turtles down there compared to snakes and lizards, that's true, but they've still got 6. You know, they've got desert tortoises and western, probably the same turtle we have here, the western painted turtle, and a few others that I don't know off the top of my head. But here in Washington, we've only got 2 native ones, yep.
So technically, is a tortoise a type of turtle?
Yeah, they're in the same order. I don't know exactly the classifications beyond that, but tortoises are more terrestrial. They can live in really arid environments. Some of them really don't ever go in the water. They still need water, obviously. But desert tortoises, for instance, which I've seen in the Southwest, they're in really dry places. There's no water around anywhere. Yeah, so we've only got one here in the Methow, but it's a colorful one. It's called the painted turtle for good reason. The easiest way to figure out if that's what you're looking at is to pick it up and look at its plastron, yes. And if it's got that beautiful red color on it, you know, that's going to be a painted turtle. And you say, well, if we only have one species, why would I need to check and see what it is? Well, in my experience in Washington, Exotic turtles can show up kind of anytime, anywhere. Case in point, when I lived on the west side, I had 2 or 3 different people bring me turtles and say, "What is this?" And it was a red-eared slider, the common pet store turtle that people had turned loose and they'd naturalized over there because it's in the climate's pretty favorable. But my best story about a renegade turtle was our enforcement agent over there one time came in and said, "Oh, you gotta see this." So we go out to his truck and he pulls out this snapping turtle, probably that big around, out of his truck, and holds it up. So I just pulled this out of the Skagit River. So you just never know. I've never seen anything but these guys locally are painted turtles. And they like slower water, so you're not going to see them in the Methow or the Chewuk or the Twist River, but you're going to see them in some of our ponds and maybe slower moving streams. They like to come out of the water, eat any goods, and bask frequently, particularly here in the north where they got to soak up whatever warmth they can get when they can get it.
How far out are you from
So, in terms of their ecology, they're omnivorous. They're eating, I would say, the majority of their diet's plants, but they'll also eat aquatic invertebrates, insects. They'll even scavenge a little bit on carrion if they find it. In the wintertime, they're often burrowed into the mud, under the ice, waiting out winter that we already talked about. They reproduce, or they don't reproduce, I should say, until they're about 5 or 6 years old. Again, remember, turtles are long-lived, so they can afford to wait a few years before they get started. And they'll go up to like 500 feet from the water to nest to find suitable terrain if they need to.
What do they do for air in the wintertime?
We're going to get to that.
Great.
For air when they're underwater, you mean? Yeah. Okay. In fact, I think it's the next slide. Yes, it is. So turtles, these guys are pretty cold tolerant, in fact, amazingly so. They can actually absorb oxygen from the water through their skin during the winter. So this photograph, again, local photograph, this is from Big Twin Lake, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Somebody called me up and said, "You won't believe it, there's turtles running around under the ice." I thought, I believe that. So I went out, and sure enough, there were several painted turtles in the shallows, very slowly moving around under the ice, probably looking for a spot to spend the rest of the winter. It was just amazing to watch. Hatchlings can actually, sometimes they'll actually overwinter in the nest. They may not hatch until well into the fall, and so they just stay there, and they can actually freeze and survive the winter in a frozen state, which just, I still don't, that's hard to comprehend. And they do that by pumping glucose out of their liver into their cells, and that keeps the cells from freezing and bursting. But ice forms outside the cells, and it'll actually stop their hearts from beating, and yet once they thaw out and warm up, they get going again, and life is good. It's something we don't completely understand, but there's ramifications. I mean, if we could understand this better, it could help us with organ transplants and other medical breakthroughs. We talked about absorbing O2 through their skin. Again, pretty neat stuff.
Scott?
Yep.
They only do that in the winter?
Oh, I mean, they have that capability probably at any time to a certain degree, but when they're really cold, they don't need that much, and so they're able to get enough to keep going. If they're more active, I don't think they could survive on that alone. You'll see them like bob up to the surface, the little head pops up, they take a breath, and they go down. That's their normal routine. But if their metabolism's down near zero, then they can get by just by absorbing through their skin. Yep.
Do you find them in like seasonal ponds or some ponds?
Good question. So can we find them in what we call ephemeral or seasonal ponds? Generally, I would say no, and the reason I say generally is because if it's a pond that's ephemeral, pretty often the turtles figure that out and they go other places. But sometimes after a prolonged dry spell, maybe a pond that holds water most of the time dries up, you get this mass exodus of turtles. And this happened, I don't know, Mary, maybe you remember, maybe 7, 8 years ago. It was really dry, all the ponds were drying up, and all these turtles came out of Barnsley Lake and were just migrating everywhere. I probably relocated 6 or 8 or 10 of them. So, cool critter, where do you go to see them? Well, Again, they're kind of a low elevation, so I would say the shrub steppe to the ponderosa pine zone kind of a critter, places that are sunny, and I spelled that wrong, I see. And specifically, where I see them almost without fail are places like the pond. The pond's along the Carlton Road, south of Twist Bear. Davis Lake's a good spot, Patterson, Barnsley, Peregrine. There's a laundry list, but those are some of the most dependable probably.
Is that the beaver pond look like Chickadee?
Yes. In fact, that turtle, I could figure this out. That turtle is one that my daughter and I relocated that was fleeing Barnsley Lake when it dried out. So if I figured out how old she was there, I could tell you what year that was. But, so it's a while ago. If you decide to handle them, handling them's fine. They're pretty squirmy, and they do have sharp little claws on their feet. You don't think about turtles as having claws, but they really do. And so they're just constantly doing this, and so you get kind of scratched, but it's not that big of a deal. They can bite, so I wouldn't try to put your finger in its mouth. Yep.
A quick question, is a big turtle an old turtle or not necessarily?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, they continue to grow. They kind of sort of hit a maximum size at some point, but in general, for anywhere from several to quite a few years, they're actually going to get bigger. So yes, bigger is older typically. Lizards.
Oh, one more question.
Yep.
Do we have any idea how old painted turtles can?
I don't specifically. I don't. But, most any of the turtles and tortoises have, I would say, lifespans in the decades. Mm-hmm. And it's the tortoises in particular that seem to really live a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so lizards. So what differentiates lizards from some of the other critters you're going to talk about, or we'll talk about tonight and or next week? And one thing is claws on its digits. And you say, well, that's kind of obvious. Yeah, lizards have claws. But salamanders don't. And I've had a lot of people who will find a critter and say, I found this weird little, bright gold lizard and a bright gold stripe. And I'm thinking, no, that's an animal you're going to talk about next week. Next week. Is John next or amphibians next? Okay. So if it doesn't have claws, it's not a lizard. If it does, it is, assuming it's a herp to begin with.
Who's that one?
That is a picture I took in Utah. So I'm pretty sure it's a zebra tail lizard. That's at Zion National Park. Lizards have external ear openings. You mentioned that in the quiz about the fence lizards, and that's a difference between lizards and snakes. Snakes don't have any ear openings. And there are a couple of lizards that, depending on the angle, the lighting, how you see them, sometimes you think maybe it's a snake, but if it's got an ear opening, it's not. I take that back. 3 of our 4 local species can lose and regrow their tail. And it's something that they can do over and over again even. And for those of you who caught lizards as a kid, you've got to have experienced this. The tails break off pretty readily, they often twitch. Oh, Mary, I didn't plug my computer in.
There's a plug right below you.
Okay. Hang on, technical difficulties.
Seems to have a fitting tail.
I think his computer is telling him that it's must be plugged in. Uh-oh.
You don't have a laptop here, do you?
Yeah, I have a laptop.
You got PowerPoint for it?
No, I do. It'll work. It is a Dell.
Twice as a bird. Okay, so where were we? So they regrow tails and lose tails. So if you're handling lizards, that's something to be aware of. The tail's pretty delicate. It's not, it's not going to hurt the animal to lose that end of its tail, but I don't know, it always makes you feel bad. It's like, oh, dang, broke his tail off. But it does grow back. Lizards tend to shed their skin in pieces as opposed to snakes that often shed it in one long piece. So sometimes if you find a skin and it's It's like a big long piece. I mean, sometimes it's obvious it's a snake. Sometimes it's a little difficult to tell. But if it's a bunch of pieces, it was probably a lizard.
Scott,
Yep.
can you show me where the ear opening is on?
Yeah, I meant to, I should have put in another slide or a close-up. But the ear opening on this guy is like right there.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Keep your eyes open. We'll probably see a good picture at some point that shows that better. So here's some more terms to impress friends. Some of these I think we touched on a little bit last or 2 weeks ago. Oviparous, that means that the animal lays eggs, young hatch from eggs. Viviparous means they give birth to live young. I always have trouble pronouncing this one. Autotomy, I believe, is how that's pronounced. That's the spontaneous casting off of a body part, in this case, the tail. And it's not so much that the lizard, shoots the tail off. There's an enzyme when it's grabbed that just makes it come off really easy, makes it detach easy.
Does it grow the vertebrates back in where the increased tail comes out of part of the
Good point.
spine goes with it? Does it grow back bone too?
Don't know if there's bone that far down. That's a really good question. Not sure. Yep.
So some lizards are oviparous and some are viviparous?
Yes.
Oh.
And we will point out in each case which one they are.
So do you know, is there some evolutionary reason why?
Oh, we'll talk about that at the very end too, or one reason anyway, why that might be a preferred strategy. Very good questions. So again, to pauper it, we don't have a whole lot of these in the Methow. We've only got like what did I say before? 4 or 5 species that we know of? Okay. Yeah, here we go. Next slide. I'm getting ahead of myself. So worldwide, there's lots of lizards. Within the Tucson 100-mile circle, there's 45 different species. If you're down there trying to keep track and identify all those, you got a chore. Up here in Washington, we've only got 7 statewide. We've got 6 in a 100-mile circle around the Methow, but only 4 to 5 that have actually been documented here in the valley. 4 for sure, 5 probably with sagebrush lizard. We just gotta get a photograph. Just have to throw that. I had to throw that Gila monster picture in just because you got to see one last week. That's just such a cool animal. I had a really unique opportunity several years back. Dan Beck had a student who was doing work on Gila monsters down out of St. George in Utah. So I went down for a week and traipsed around with him for a couple of days and radio tracked live Gila monsters. It was great. Methow lizard. So we've got 3 different families represented here in the valley, and they're each a little different. So the first family, the alligator lizard, that's the most snake-like of the ones we have locally. Oh, here's a good ear opening picture. See that right there?
That little black dot.
Yeah, that little black dot. That's what you're looking for. These guys are relatively common in the right places. Skinks, well, we'll go through them individually, I guess. I'll save that. And the one on the right is a shorthorn lizard, which we'll talk about also in a second. Talk about the northern alligator lizard first. I'm assuming the name alligator lizard is because they kind of look like an alligator, it's just kind of their shape and body form. When I was a kid, we had southern alligator lizards in Eugene, Oregon that got quite large. And they could give you a good bite, like, open up your skin. And so alligator lizard, I thought at the time, was a very apt name for those. They're in our forested habitats more so than, say, the shrub steppe. In fact, I was trying to think when I was putting this together, have I ever seen one of these in a really open environment? And off the top of my head, I'm going to say no. They're usually like into the ponderosa pine, Doug fir zone, but it's usually in areas that do have openings so that they can get some sunshine and get warmed up. Usually there's some rocks involved too, whether it's a little cliff band or a talus slope or some sort of rock available as well. They're fairly short in terms of their body. Their tails are really long, but their body is pretty short. They're kind of a long, skinny critter. They look kind of snake-like, and in this picture, so it's, oops, he's got his legs tucked in. You know, you'd almost think that was a snake if you weren't looking closely. But you see that little ear opening there, and you go, nope, that's not a snake. My notation here, when you see S to V, that means snout to vent length. So that's the length of the animal, not counting its tail, basically. So these guys are pretty small. That's pretty typical color. It's kind of an olive brown with kind of a black and white check pattern that's variable. Sometimes it's really distinct, sometimes not.
So wait, so body length is snout to vent?
Snout to vent is just body length.
Okay,
And then the tail's extra. Well, the back legs are like just ahead of the vent, probably. So a little bit about the way these guys make a living. They're insectivores. They're primarily eating bugs. Their own bodies, research suggests they don't move around a whole lot. You know, they have a really fairly restricted territory. These guys bear live young. So these are viviparous. This is one of the viviparous lizards. And they reproduce every year. I'm trying to remember where I took that picture. I can't off the top of my head. I want to say at the Pittsburgh. So, cool facts. So these guys occur, at least within the Northwest, in moister and cooler habitats than any other lizard. They're even found on the southern Oregon, or excuse me, on most of the Oregon coast and the southwest coast of Washington. That's pretty unusual. You know, lizards are usually where it's a little sunnier and warmer more of the time. So that's a cool fact about these guys. Cold tolerance, keep that in mind. So if you want to see these guys, where do you go? Well, again, Doug fir, pea pine Doug fir zone, south facing, a little drier typically. Places where I've seen them, War Creek Bridge, I think that's one that John's seen it before, Cougar Lake. West Fork Methow, yes, I've definitely seen them there on the trail. Buck Lake, Chewart River Road, I've seen quite a few, sometimes dead, unfortunately, on the Chewart River Road. I've seen them often, actually now that I think about it, on the trail into Black Lake. You go through those rocky openings, those little talus slopes, that's a really good place to see these guys. So next up, one that's kind of a favorite of mine in a lot of ways, the shorthorn lizard, or the pygmy shorthorn lizard, or as a lot of people call them, horny toads. Yeah. This is the smallest of the horned lizard species, and it's also found farthest north. This is a critter, when you look at the other species that are in this family, we associate more with desert environments. But these guys are really interesting because in Oregon and Washington, they occur in places that you just don't think of as horny toad country. You know, horny toads are in the desert, they're in the sand, they're places that have cactus, that kind of thing. These guys occur in really weird places. So here locally, well, let's talk about it a little bit first, and I'll tell you about where to find them. So they're generally open shrub steppe, up to about 3,500 feet plus. This lizard in this picture is sitting at about 3,550 feet, probably. And Okanagan County is the northern limit of their range. They used to occur in southern BC, but they're considered extirpated there now. And well, let's look at the next picture. It's better. You know, they're small, they're round, they're pretty flat. They have these little pointy scales or horns on kind of the edges of their body and on the edges of their heads. That's how they get the name horned lizard. Most horned lizards have much more pronounced horns. These guys, they barely show. Hence the name. They're what we call semi-fossorial, so that means they're underground a lot. They dig little burrows or use little rodent burrows both in the wintertime when they're hibernating and during the summer. They'll go dormant when it's really hot. They'll stay in the ground and come out when the temperature's more favorable. These guys are also viviparous. They're live young.
How'd they swallow that pill?
It was difficult. Lots of water. But that one on the right, you know, that's a Advil pill. That's how tiny these things are.
Is that a full grown one, or is that
That's a baby. That's a little one. Yeah, probably a neonate, probably first year. But the one on the left, that's about as big as they get. So they don't get much bigger than that. And they're tough to find. And the reason they're tough to, well, so again, these guys also eat lizards in general. Just think of them as bug eaters, because that's typically what they're doing. But these guys are kind of a little bit more of a specialist. Most of their diet often is ants. Yep, they like ants. I know, I wish I could have some in my house at times. So, they're hard to find because the cool fact about these guys is they're incredibly cryptic. And what we mean by that is they blend into their background like nothing else. And you know, these pictures illustrate that. And their color tends to vary depending on what kind of background is available where they live. So the let's see. That one, and that one, I'm pretty sure are all on the top of Patterson Mountain, which we'll talk about in a minute. The one in the upper right, though, is a really interesting one. So we found this one in the Tunk Valley. We were over there on a field trip after the Tunk fire, and we were out in the middle of thousands of acres of absolute desolation. I mean, it didn't look like there was a living thing out there. It was just gray, mud, ash, wasteland. And my assistant all of a sudden yells like, "You won't believe it, get over here." And we run up there, here's this little shorthorn lizard out there in the middle of the gray. And he doesn't look, I mean, he's cryptic, but maybe not super cryptic in this picture, because I have a hunch maybe we moved him a little bit for the photograph. But what I want you to look at, if you look close, it's hard to see with this projector, but there's little yellow dots. So those little yellow dots were exactly the color of the lichen on a rock, about 4 feet away. And if he was sitting on that rock, there was no way you would see it.
So do they change their pattern? Like, are they like chameleons where they can change, or are they born matching where they're from?
I think it's the latter. I haven't heard that they're really able to change much. There is a lizard that does do that a little bit that we'll talk about in a minute, but I haven't heard that about these guys. I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect just over time they evolved to match the habitat that they're in. Yeah.
Right there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. Yes. Question.
You may get to this, I was just noticing on David's list, it says, these are rare. Could it be just because they're cryptic and so people don't find them as often? Or do you agree that compared to the others are all listed as common in the Methow, but these are listed as rare?
I would say both. And what I mean by that is they're rare in general because they're only found in select spots. But those select spots where they occur, I would say they're locally abundant or locally more common. And I'll tell you, this slide, here's where you find these things. So these guys are found locally here. Well, let me back up a little bit. So in general, these are common like down in the Columbia Basin. So if you're out in a native shrub steppe down in the Columbia Basin, these guys are pretty common. It's not a big deal. Up here in the Methow, though, they don't occur in most of our shrub steppe. They occur on top of little knobs where you've got at least some loose soil and usually openings between the shrubs. And one way to sort of know if you're in the right place is it a place where bitterroot grows? If it is, then that's a good starting point in terms of looking for shorthorn lizards. And here locally, so we know they're on Patterson, we know they're on Lewis Butte. Those two places, people see them frequently, and we've had documentation going back quite a ways. I've heard people tell me they're on some mountain. I've looked up there a couple of times, not real extensively. Haven't found them yet. Wouldn't surprise me. I have seen a couple of photographs from some knobs on the big buck, like above Dead Horse Lake. There's a couple of knobs where I think they occur. And there's bitterroot, yep. And then I have to give a shout out to Ms. Bergen here, who took that photograph there below me. I think that's your picture. Yes, of one on Stud Horse. So Stud Horse is now a spot where they've been documented. And again, it's up kind of near the top, right? Kind of the top of the hill for the most part. Yeah. So that's where you look for these. And so if you're out and about and you're up high on a little knob somewhere, keep your eyes open. And if it's not one of these places on the list, I would love to know about it. Because yes, they are rare in terms of the number of places they occur. There's something else I was going to tell you about that. Oh yeah, so to find these things, because they're so cryptic, we talked about how they blend in, showed you the photos. You can't just go out there and expect to see one. They have to move, or you're never going to see them. So if you're going up the trail to Lewis Butte or to Patterson, just focus about 6 feet in front of you, maybe. Don't walk super fast. And as you get, when you get to the part on Patterson where the loop trail sort of splits off in the one piece, from there to the top is where you usually find them. I suspect there may be a few places a little lower down where they occur, but all the ones I've seen have been from that junction to the top. So in that stretch, stay focused, watch for movement. They're not terribly hard to catch because they're not that fast. They're short little squat things, and once you get them, it's like they're like, okay, I give up. And they'll just sit there in your hand, and you can turn them over. And they're really fun. I think they're adorable. If there's any lizard that fits that description, it's the short-horned lizard. They're adorable things. Western fence lizard. Different in a lot of ways from the short-horned lizard. Different family, just sort of a different lifestyle. These guys, they're kind of like the alligator lizard in that I would say most places I see these, there's some forest cover there or nearby, so kind of, again, open dry forest, usually fairly rocky. Their morphology or their appearance, usually the roughness of their scales is notable. You're kind of like, wow, that thing looks like it's got sandpaper on its back. It's kind of got a rough texture to it. Their color varies a fair amount, and apparently these guys can add or subtract pigment from their skin to help match their environment. It's nowhere near as dramatic as a chameleon, but they do have some ability to vary their shade a bit anyway. And you'll see these guys, sometimes really dark, sometimes really light, sometimes obvious blotches, sometimes not. And I think, and then the males. So one way to know this is what you're looking at, particularly where these occur with sagebrush lizards. So in other parts of the state where sagebrush lizards are common, they look very similar. But if you flip them over, and you see this blue throat patch, that's a fence lizard. Sagebrush lizard doesn't have that, if it's a male. Females are tougher yet. Let's see, what else? Again, bug eaters. These guys are egg layers. Oh, and I was going to preface that comment by saying, compared to alligator lizards, I think I see these guys in a little bit warmer, drier environments, typically. A little bit lower elevation often. So look at that picture. See the color and pattern variations just between those two animals? Those are both local pictures, so they vary a lot. Cool facts. Here's another local one that's different yet. This is a really cool fact. So somebody did some work and found out that places where these guys occur, there's less incidence of Lyme disease. And apparently it's because when ticks feed on these guys, it kills the spirochete. The bacteria that causes Lyme disease dies. And so you can read the stats there. Where these guys are found, only 5% of the ticks tested carried Lyme, versus in places where they did not occur, 50% of the ticks carried Lyme. So this is a critter you want to have near your house. I'm lucky, I have a few near mine, and I welcome them with open arms. Yeah, they will do push-ups. Yeah, very good. Yeah, kind of. It's a display. It's a territorial display thing. You'll see them like on a piece of wood or a rock, and doing their little. Yeah, I forgot about that. You're right. So where do you go see these? Again, kind of dry, rocky, ponderosa pine areas, pine forest, at the top of pine forest. I don't remember whose house it is, but there's a couple of houses up there, and there's like a vacant lot next door, and somebody told me there's short-horned lizards everywhere. I was like, oh, wow, really? So I went running up there. It was all fence lizards, but lizards at least, and lots of them. I was impressed. The other place where I saw a ton of these one time was just south of Aspen Lake, up on that ridge. Lots of these. I haven't been up there post-fire, so that'd be interesting to see. They're still there. Excuse me. We see these commonly when we're working around rattlesnake dens. I think the environment that rattlesnakes like is also pretty favorable for lizards.
Will a rattlesnake eat one?
Not typically. I mean, it's not unheard of for rattlesnake to eat a lizard, especially a baby or a small rattlesnake. But they're focused mainly on warm-blooded stuff, which John will talk about at length in a couple of weeks. And it used to be at the Lost River cabins. They've upgraded those a little bit. But years ago, they were kind of rough wood siding. And I remember I would stop there and see sometimes multiple fence lizards on the side of those cabins. These guys are fast. So we talked about short-horn lizards, easy to catch, handle. These guys are hard to catch. They're really fast. You got to be really patient and slow, and they're really good at getting under stuff. They're pretty squirmy when you grab them. They might bite. I mean, it's not going to be a big deal, but they may try to bite you. So the western skink, again, kind of a completely different critter than the last couple we talked about. So these guys, again, I would say are kind of towards the lower elevations. I've seen these animals definitely out in really open shrub steppe, and also in somewhat forested environments, but usually places with some rock. These were the hardest ones for me to characterize their habitat, because I've seen them in kind of variable places. But in general, I know, and you don't see them often. They don't spend a lot of time on the surface, so it's kind of hard to get a handle on what they're doing. But when you do find one, they're just a beautiful little creature. And they occur, in a little bit moister and cooler areas than some of our others. Because I have seen these, like I have them at my house, and I'm on the north side of Patterson, and it's awful shady and cool in there. And I've seen them in other places that it's kind of like, wow, there's a lizard here, and it's kind of a dark spot. I just can't think of a place where I've seen them up very high, but that may just be coincidence. Long body, short legs, again, they almost look sort of snake-like. They have really shiny, small, really smooth scales. They're neat to handle. The striping pattern's really obvious, and of course the blue tail is obvious most of the time. As the animals age, the blue tail tends to fade, particularly in the males, I think. They're eating small invertebrates and bugs again. They actually will construct burrows, dig little burrows, those smooth, shiny. Think about this for a snake we're going to talk about later. Smooth, shiny scales are great if you're a burrower. Less friction, you slide into stuff easier. These guys lay eggs. And I don't remember where that came from, but they live up to 8 years. I don't know if that's long or short. I haven't decided. I don't know. So the cool fact about these guys, this is the only lizard in the Northwest anyway that actually guards its eggs or stays with its eggs to protect them. Probably from insects.
Do both of them or just the female?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer. I'm going to guess just the female.
Yeah.
Yep.
So how would they burrow? Would they grab the dirt and move with their head?
I don't know. What I can tell you is I have seen these guys. I saw more of these in one day than I've seen probably in all the years since. And when that happened, I was looking for a creature we'll only talk about briefly that you got to see last week, though, which was amazing, which was a night snake. I spent an entire day in the Okanagan Valley one time flipping rocks looking for night snakes. And we found a lot of these guys. So they're under rocks a lot. And we were in areas that were like near rattlesnake dens. That's kind of where you look for night snakes. There were a lot of these guys there. I suspect these are a primary prey of night snakes. But beautiful. This is arguably the prettiest little lizard we have, just in terms of its color and its markings. Again, where I've seen it most often is kind of canyon, rimrock country, usually where there's some kind of loose surface rock. And that doesn't necessarily mean talus, but it means like there's rocks on the surface of the ground that they can burrow under and get under. Again, don't see them out and about very much. A lot of people will be excavating, digging something, and they'll find one of these. Where to see them here locally? I honestly don't have a really good idea. I would suspect Pipestone's a good place to look around. Kind of meets all the criteria: canyony, rocky, surface rocks. I bet if you flip rocks in Pipestone, you'll find them. Except be careful with the rattlesnakes.
I've seen them on the edges of ponds. which
Really?
is Like when you said earlier that they like cooler places. Yeah. But,
Huh. Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, it was rocky nearby.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if that's coincidence, or maybe there's a good food source near the water's edge they're taking advantage of. I've never seen one in the water at all. We do see these occasionally when we're out doing rattlesnake den work. Handling. They are kind of delicate. This is an animal that you're going to break the tail off pretty easily if you're not careful. They got tiny little legs. You want to handle them kind of cautiously. Not for your safety, but for theirs. Yes?
Times when it's not a distinctive lizard, like orange or steep,
Yep.
you just get a glimpse.
Yep.
But how do you decide between pink lizard and
Alligator lizard, it's tough. If it's just a blur, I don't, because there's a lot of overlap between where you see those two. And she's asking you, how do you tell between a fence lizard and an alligator lizard? And you get a really fast look. The only thing I would say is that the fence lizard, and you may not get this good of a look, but it's more, it runs more like kind of a straight line run, whereas an alligator lizard is a little bit more serpentine. It's got those little short legs, and so it's doing this more, whereas a fence lizard just kind of gets up and goes. And if you can see the surface of the animal, that rough skin on a fence lizard is pretty noticeable. All right, we're going to be talking about white snakes. So, different group now. Squamata, same order as lizards, but different suborders. Serpentes, serpents. Obviously, they're one of their defining characteristics is no limbs. Also, no movable eyelids, and we've kind of already talked about no external ear openings. And they swallow large prey items whole. Actually, it's not just large prey items. They just swallow whatever they eat whole. It doesn't matter if it's large or small. They smell with their protrusible tongue. My daughter and I were arguing whether or not that was actually a word. It was in one of John's PowerPoints. We decided whether it is or not, it's a cool sounding word, so we're going to use it. These things, as Dan referenced, tend to be instinctively feared by a lot of people, but not everybody. And I think with kids in particular, curiosity, I think, often outweighs fear. And so it's great to expose kids to snakes early. So in the Methow, again, let's talk about diversity. Lots of them worldwide. There's 51 different species within 100 miles of Tucson. There's only 12 in Washington, and of those 12, there's 10 within 100 miles in the Methow, and 6 or 7, depending on whether the night snake occurs here, that are actually in the valley. That close up on the left there is a night snake, actually. The right is a gopher in my hand. More terms. Could have lots of terms to impress your friends. So, ecdysis, that's what it's called when you shed your skin. Thigmothermic, it's kind of one of my favorites. So if an animal is thigmothermic, it tends to get its heat. If it's a herp, and it's really a thigmothermic one, it's a creature that likes to get its heat from direct contact with a warmer object. More so, say, than basking in the sun. And gopher snakes, the one in the picture here, is probably the best at that. And it's a blessing and a curse. It's a good way to get warmed up, but these are the guys that end up dead on the road more than any other herd, probably, because they're out there soaking up that warmth from the highway. Selenoglyphs. These are snakes with hinged front fangs. We've only got one of those here locally, the rattlesnake, we'll talk about later. Opistoglyphs, rear fang snakes. We have a couple of those, night snake being one. I'm going to save the other one for a little bit here. And they're not, so rear fangs are not, rattlesnakes, they got the big front fangs, they're really noticeable, everybody knows what that looks like. Rear fangs are small, sometimes they're just slightly enlarged rear teeth, and they usually have grooves in them, and the venom kind of runs down the groove. It's not hypodermically injected like front fangs. So it's a different setup, and it's a completely different, did I skip a slide? No, I was going to say it's a completely different family of snakes, which we're going to talk about now. Most snakes, there's a handful of families that we're not going to talk about at all, but most snakes fall into 4 major families. The first one being Boidae, or the pythons, boas, anacondas, things of that nature. That's a boa constrictor, the same snake that Dan had here last week. That was another bonus. That was so much fun. The colubrids. So these are your everyday snake that a lot of you think of. So your garter snakes, your king snakes, your gopher snakes. These are the colubrids, and the rear fang snakes fall into this family. The Elapidae. Fortunately or unfortunately, we don't have any of those here. those are by and large, I think they're all venomous, if not most of them are. These are typically the most venomous snakes in the world. So these are your cobras, taipans, sea snakes, fear snake, all the nasty snakes, mambas. These guys will kill you. And the vipers. And the vipers do occur here locally in our one rattlesnake species, but they include other snakes as well. For instance, the furlance in Central and South America, bushmaster. There's some vipers in Africa as well. So locally, we have 3 of those 4 families represented: the colubrids, the boas, and the vipers. We'll talk a little bit about each. Gopher snake. Unlike a lot of places where I would say the snake, I almost guarantee you're going to see the most often is going to be a garter snake. Around here, I see these guys probably as much as any of the snakes. Again, partly because they're out on the roads a lot, but they're pretty common here, and they're found widespread throughout the lower elevations of the valley.
What are all the names? Gopher snake, bull snake?
Bull snake, right. Those are the 2 primary names, and bull snake gopher snake's a more appropriate name for the subspecies that we have here locally. The bull snake is the name most associated with the subspecies that occurs like in Montana and east. So I don't make a big point of it, but usually I'll tell people that insist on calling them bull snakes that, well, actually, gopher snake is really what these are. Again, open shrub steppe into the pine forest. I would say, I don't think I've ever seen one. I saw one near the top of Patterson once, that's close to 3,500 feet. That's the highest one I've ever seen. These are our longest snake, probably not our heaviest, but our longest certainly. The longest one I've got was about 4.5 feet long. I suspect with a little work I could find a 5-footer. I saw one in California one time that was at least 6 feet. It was on the other side of a ravine. I didn't have time to run over and grab it. I desperately wanted to, but he escaped being harassed. So these are one of a handful of snakes, or 3 at least, that we potentially have locally that have sort of this generalized kind of a light brown body with the dark blotches on them. So kind of keep that in mind as we go through a couple of the others. That's a pretty good example, that photograph there, because that blotching really shows. So gopher snakes, even though they're not a boa, they are a constrictor. They do wrap around their prey, they do squeeze it till it stops breathing and the heart stops beating, and then they swallow it. And they're kind of a generalist, so they're going to eat small mammals, but they're also going to eat birds and lizards. We mentioned they're strongly thigmothermic, which means... Yes. They're out on the road soaking up the heat. These guys lay eggs. They're they're oviparous. They're one of our lower elevation snakes compared to some of the others. And they'll often use rodent burrows to do that, which is kind of neat. Again?
Unless you're a rodent.
Unless you're a rodent, correct. Yeah, they probably empty the burrow before they lay the eggs. Cool facts. So they do, first of all, one myth to bust, they do not eat rattlers. I've never seen or heard of that being documented, particularly here locally. I have seen these community netting with rattlesnakes. I've seen them in the same general locations. John keeps them in the same terrarium regularly. So no, if you have gopher snakes around your house, they're not going to eat the rattlesnakes or keep the rattlesnakes away. However, they are a really good rattlesnake mimic. What I mean by that is not only do they look like a rattlesnake, at least superficially, or actually more than superficially, they will act like a rattlesnake. So they'll curl up, they'll hiss, they'll strike. They'll actually flatten their head out to make it look more bigger and more triangular. And they'll even rattle their tail, particularly if they're in like loose substrate like leaves or gravel, and make a noise with the tail. It's amazing. They put on quite a show. You know, you're thinking, whoa, they're aggressive. In fact, they are more, I would say hands down on average, they are more aggressive than rattlesnakes. They're going to be putting on a show. What's interesting, I guess I'll talk about that in another slide, is they're pretty much all bark and no bite. They're also great climbers. I've seen them up on buildings and up into branches. John watched one time basically just crawl right up the side of a building. I don't know how it's stuck on there. Get into a bird's nest and eat all the baby birds in the nest and come down. So pretty amazing. Red-tailed stand-up. So these guys their primary predator is a red-tailed hawk. Numerous times I've seen a red-tail flying over the valley with a snake in its talons. Probably a gopher snake or a rattlesnake. They do eat rattlesnakes too. But these snakes are big enough that occasionally, especially if it's a young red-tail, doesn't quite know what it's doing. I've heard of at least 2 occasions, and this is locally between, say, here and Brewster, where the snake had the bird as much as the bird had the snake, and somebody found them, basically locked in a death grip together and separated them. Both survived. Yeah. So it's not always a one-way street when a red-tail goes after a gopher snake. These guys are really strong. If you hold them, you'll understand. They're constrictor, they're just packed full of muscle. Yep.
On the rattler thing,
Yep.
about the not eating rattlesnakes, people say that if you have a neighborhood of gopher snakes, that you don't see rattling, it's just dumb luck. If there's no relationship between.
I think my mic died, but yes, that is my experience. It's dumb luck. Now, there are reasons why rattlesnakes aren't there, but it has nothing to do with gopher snakes. They have a couple of other more specific habitat needs that probably preclude them from being in that location, but it has nothing to do with gopher snakes. Yeah. So viewing. These guys are pretty much everywhere in the shrub steppe. The best way to find these is to go out on roads early in the evening after a hot day, like right at dusk and after it's just starting to get dark, and they'll come out on the roads. That's kind of the general, I guess, technique or hint I would give you. The other way to find these things frequently is early and late in the season. I would say particularly May, when they're kind of dispersing from wherever they've hibernated, they're just more active. So you see them out on the roads a lot, and the temperatures are such that they can be active most all day. It's not too hot, not too cold, which is why we do our Snake Day in May. So if you all come out for Snake Day, unless it's really rainy, I guarantee you we will find a gopher snake. Places to find them though, Upper Bear Creek Road, like near the wildlife area headquarters. I pull them off the road there all the time. Gun Ranch Road's another good one. So I mentioned these guys are pretty much all bark and no bite. So yeah, you walk up to one and it's just going nuts, it's striking, it's hissing, you just think, I want no part of that. Well, if it's me, I kind of walk up real slow, quiet, wait for them to settle down, slip a hand underneath, pick them up. Once you've held them for, I don't know, 30 seconds, maybe a minute, and you're not squeezing them, they're not being hurt, they calm down, and then they're really pretty easy to handle, and they actually make a great snake to like take into classrooms and show kids, because they, even though they strike and hiss, off the top of my head, I cannot remember being bitten by an adult. I've had the little guys, the little ones sometimes. I think they're just desperate, so they're just biting whatever they can get their teeth into. but they're just, they're intimidating, but they calm down pretty quickly.
Is it better where you grab them?
Yeah, I was going to talk about that at the end a little bit, but I'll real quickly, don't grab them behind the head.
No.
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 Just, you want to be slow, smooth, no jerky movements, and pick them up like right in the middle. Even two hands. They're pretty squirmy at first, but if you try to grab them behind the head, think about if you were picked up behind the back of the head. That would hurt, you'd be uncomfortable, you'd feel really defenseless. No, don't do that. John, in this photograph, I wouldn't just grab them by the tail either, and I don't think that's what he did. I think he picked it up in the middle and then picked up the tail, because you want to support as much of the body weight as you can. Okay. You asked. It's tricky to photograph with one hand, with the snake with the other, because like I say, they tend to move a lot. And this was not one I'd had, in captivity. This is just oh, hey, there's a gopher snake. So I picked it up. And he's already calmed down. He's checking me out. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears a little bit, at least in terms of the handling of this particular animal. Western racer. Gets in the colubrid family again, like the one we just talked about, the gopher snake, but it's not a constrictor. It's very much, of all the snakes that we're going to talk about tonight, other than the night snake potentially at the end, this is the one I would most associate with low elevation, open shrub steppe environment. See these out in the wide open stuff a lot. They get into the pine forest a little bit, they don't go much higher than that though. They're long and thin, very pointy tail.
We'll look for a little bit. These are all
Okay, thanks. Dull green to gray color pretty consistently, but underneath they're kind of a shiny yellow cream color, which is quite pretty. You just don't get to see it very often unless you actually handle one. But one of their standout features is this large dark eye. We'll touch on that again here in a second. So their ecology. These guys, they're really fast moving. As a result, they're pretty effective predators on lizards, which are also fast moving. But they're kind of like the gopher snake. They're a bit of a generalist. They get big enough to eat small mammals, mice and chipmunks and whatever. Insects, frogs, even eggs, birds' eggs on the ground they'll eat. And they're just a grab and swallow predator. Again, they're not a constrictor. These are oviparous. They lay eggs. They tend to be in warmer, more open environments. And they lay eggs. Let's see, do I have? Yes, I do. So cool facts. A couple, talked about the big black eye. This photo really shows that nicely. They're very visual and very diurnal hunters. Diurnal meaning daytime. You see these guys out in the middle of the day. It's not too hot frequently. And often, when you first see them in particular, they look just like this with their head up, sometimes even higher than that. And they're using that big eye to visually scan for stuff. They're a very visual predator. It's fun watching. They got their head up and they're looking. And they're super hard to catch because they see well, they're super fast. I mean, of all the snakes, this is by far the hardest one to catch. The other kind of interesting fact is this is the snake we probably most commonly see sharing a den with rattlesnakes. So again, viewing, as I mentioned, anywhere in the shrub steppes, fair game. They're pretty widespread. Places with lizards, if it's a place where you routinely see lizards, that's probably a good place to look for these. Gun Ranch Road, when we do Snake Day up in the Gun Ranch, we usually see several. Again, handling the cheetah snake super fast. I have literally on Snake Day, when it's like, oh, I want the students to see this, done dives, to catch these things. Because if they get into the thick brush, they're gone. Oh yeah, right. So, let's see, did I talk about that with the... Oh, I didn't. I meant to talk about that with every snake. Okay, gopher snake. So, as a defensive mechanism, most snakes will empty their anal sac onto you. And sometimes it's just, the contents of their bowels. But some snakes also specifically make a really musky, nasty substance that they inject onto you. So, we'll back up here for a second. Gopher snakes, I would say, empty themselves on you maybe 25% of the time. These guys, pretty much always. Pretty much always. And and because they're so fast, and because you almost never have the opportunity to slowly bend down and pick one up, you gotta kind of grab them quick, and they almost always bite. Which is not a big deal. Yes, they can break the skin a little bit, but it's not gonna hurt you. Wandering garter snake. This snake is sort of the, what we call the iconic garden snake, or the snake that's most likely that people see in their yard or in their garden, because they're a real generalist. They're found like everywhere. I would say during the heat of the summer, they tend to associate a little bit more with water, but in general, they're found all over the landscape. They go up to relatively high elevations, well into the conifer forest. Terrestrial and semi-aquatic, and I mentioned during the summer they're a little bit tight, closer to the water. They're good swimmers. You'll actually see them in ponds and streams fairly frequently. These guys get reasonably large, long, slender snake. Again, they're in the colurid family. That tends to be the pattern for colubrids, longer, skinnier snake. Up to 43 inches. I would say the biggest one I've seen around here is 2.5, 3 feet. Many color morphs. Of all the snakes here in the valley, this is the most variable in terms of its color morphs. That picture on the bottom, so these are both the same species. This is one I caught locally. This was one down near Chelan, I think it was. And I had to blow the picture up and talk to the guy who took the picture. I didn't take that picture, and yes, it had the pattern. It was a garter snake for sure, and we determined it was a western terrestrial. Almost black though. Relative to another snake we're going to see in a minute, what I want you to take a look at is the dorsal stripe, which is that line going down the back. See how it's not terribly indistinct and how the black blotches tend to overlap the edges? Just keep that in mind. As I mentioned, very diverse in terms of its habitat use, and consequently has a very diverse diet. Basically anything it can swallow that's a living critter it's going to eat. What else? Again, these are grab and swallow like the racer. They don't constrict. Live young. I mentioned these guys occur at relatively high elevations in cooler environments. They are viviparous.
Can they eat a rough skinned meat?
You're stealing my thunder.
Carry on.
And to be honest though, I want to say I think so, but they're close cousin definitely, so we'll get there. Some of these guys migrate quite a ways from hibernacula, from where they spend the winter. Like our rattlesnakes that we've tagged, John can give you a more specific number, but I want to say the farthest we've had one go from the den is maybe 2.5 miles or so. These guys go double or triple that sometimes from where they're hibernating. So these guys are an epistoglyph, which means they are a rear fang snake with toxic saliva. It's not a risk to people, but if you are a newt or a frog or something like that, yes.
And it like paralyzes them?
Yeah, pretty much. I don't remember the chemistry specifically. I know it better for rattlesnakes. I want to say though it's a neurotoxin, not positive. Where to see these guys? Everywhere. They're all over the valley. But again, in the summer, you'll see them regularly near water. So in the middle of the summer, look around rivers, ponds, and this doesn't matter, fast moving, slow moving, just find water. Handling, yes, always poop. In fact, even more so than racers. Racers are maybe 85%. These guys are like 99%. You pick up a garter snake, it's going to poop on you. May bite, probably not as often as a racer. As long as you're willing to get a little stinky and knowing you can wash your hands later, there's no reason you can't handle them. Oh, on video. This is the grab and swallow technique. Yeah. That is a dead baby mouse. But I actually had to feed a boa. Boa wasn't interested. Garter snake never turns down a meal. It took him a little while, so I'm not going to play the whole video.
When I've been snorkeling in the river and
Yeah.
seen them at the bottom of a pool,
Yeah.
you know, like
Well, have you seen them or this snake? that's
okay,
on the screen now?
I don't know. This
I
one.
bet it was this one.
But how can they handle, like, that's still cold water in the middle of the summer.
Yeah, it is. So they are out there foraging for a while, and they come out and bask, and they go forage. They'll ectothermic, up and down. Yep. Common garter snake, closely related to the last one we just talked about. You'll hear these called valley garter snake too, so I should have mentioned. The previous one, western terrestrial or wandering, kind of two different names, wandering garter snake, which is technically the kind of the subspecies common name would be wandering garter snake. This one, the common garter snake or valley garter snake, again, very widespread. I think this is the most widespread species in North America, as a matter of fact. And they're widespread not only in terms of their geographic distribution, but elevationally, unless you're really high, you could run into them. I've seen these things in the middle of the Poseidon. They're all over the place. You'll even find them out in the open shrub steppe if there's water available. You're not going to find them in a vast expanse of dry land that doesn't have any water probably, but virtually anywhere else, yes. They get pretty long. I caught one of these when I was a little kid that was, I bet you it was 4 feet long, or 3.5 to 4 feet long. I was shocked. I was probably only, I don't know, 10 or 12 years old. I was so excited. My dad was scared to death, but I was so excited. More aquatic than the western terrestrial, and that's why I'm thinking if you saw one snorkeling, it could have been either, but I've seen these guys so often in the water, actually completely under hunting,
I've seen them in the
that I would guess this is what you saw. So we talked about the striping on the last one. Look at the stripe on this one. Much more prominent typically, and it's also got usually a stripe on either side to some degree. And it's usually got some red in it. Not always, but most of the time it's got some red spotting that sometimes is really vibrant. Again, kind of like the racer, they have a pretty good sized eye. They're often head up. And they're more visual than some of the other snakes, especially one we're going to talk about in a minute. That one doesn't show the dorsal stripe as well, but really well-defined dorsal stripe on the back. If you see a snake and it's just got that bright yellow stripe and there's no black spots overlapping it, that's going to be your common garter snake. These guys have a pretty varied diet, like any garter snake, but because they spend a lot of time near water, they eat a lot of fish and amphibians. And you mentioned cold tolerance. Yeah, these are the most cold tolerant snake we have, probably. Herpetology are in that same arena maybe, but these guys, in terms of their cold water tolerance, are unmatched, I would say. They mate right when they emerge from the den in the spring. These are communal hibernators. So the largest, that's in my cool facts slide, I think. I'm preempting myself. They will form mating balls of like 100 males around one female. Females are bigger. These are viviparous, live young, very cold tolerant. There's a pattern emerging here. Cool facts, resistance to toxic amphibians. These guys for sure, because they eat a lot of amphibians, I know they are. They're not necessarily 100% resistant, but resistant enough. And that resistance varies locally, probably where they overlap rough-skinned newts and western toads, which we have here, they're probably more resistant. World's largest snake concentration. Communal den up in Manitoba. Why in Manitoba? Where they have way colder winters than we do, and yet these guys survive there. I mean, there's thousands of snakes in this communal den. It's just amazing.
It's eating a fish.
That is eating a tiger salamander, I believe. I think that's a local picture, too. The one on the right's a picture from that giant den in Manitoba. Where to find them? Kind of already talked about that. Any place there's water. Methow and Chewuk rivers in particular, you walk enough to the stream bank on the Methow and Chewuk, you're going to see one of these, pretty much guaranteed. Garter snake always poops, might bite. Alrighty, I go back and forth as to whether or not it's the gopher snake or the boa. It's kind of my favorite. I love to handle both of these. Boas are, there are one representative of this family. They're way different than any other of the other snakes we talked about in many respects. They're pretty widely distributed. I would say I most commonly see them in areas that are more riparian-ish, with more ground cover, leaf litter, and in drier forests up to probably at least 4,000 feet. Just trying to think of all the places I've seen these. They're generally pretty small, and I've seen, you get a 2-foot one, that's pretty big. I've caught a couple maybe that were 30 inches. Compared to the snakes, especially the last three we just talked about, they're a little thicker bodied. That's noticeable when you see them. They're kind of a little bit heavier bodied snake. But what's really, really apparent is that their head looks pretty much just like their tail. It's blunt, kind of weakly pointed. They're a pretty drab color until you flip them over. The beautiful creamy yellow underneath. We talked about skinks and their shiny, little, tiny, smooth scales. These guys have the same thing. They're there to handle them. I don't know if you guys got to hold it. Some of you probably held one of the boas from last week. Yeah. They just, I don't know, they have a very pleasing feel to them. A little bit of color variation from brown to olive, but no blotches. So we got two snakes with no blotches, the racer and the boa. Semi-fossorial, which means they're underground a fair amount of the time, or under the leaf litter. Mostly nocturnal. Early and late in the season, less so. You'll see them out more into the day, but usually the beginning and the end of the day. Rarely do you see a boa out in the middle of the day, especially in the summertime. These guys are, I would say, more of a specialist in terms of their feeding. Shrews and mice are kind of their thing. And they are a constrictor. They're in the boa family, after all. So a couple of, let's see, kind of interesting anecdotes for you. Trying to decide when to talk about those. So they're viviparous, live young, very cold tolerant. I have seen these on the Winthrop Trail riding my mountain bike probably well into October. It'll be a cold day. I'm cold. My hands are cold, and there's a snake in the trail. And it's kind of half overcast. And it's like, how is it getting any heat? Being me, I stop, I take pity, I pick the snake up, put it in my shirt against my stomach for a while, warm it up, put it back. But they're amazingly cold tolerant. I've seen them out later in the fall, I think, than any other snake. Oh, little video. So this is another baby mouse. This is like a preferred prey item for a boa. These are ones that I bought or got from John, I think. No, these were ones that my wife found in a nest in her barn, I think. That's why the nesting material was with them. So we just picked up the whole thing. I think they had died. The mother had probably died when they were exposed, and the babies died, but they were still fresh. So I took them, and this boa ate like 3 of them. It was great. Boas have lots of cool facts, so I have to narrow it down a little bit. One thing that's really cool, because they're in the boa family, they have the vestigial pelvic girdle. I think Dan talked about that, I mentioned it last week. They've got, kind of vestigial, just the traces of limbs left over from evolution. So in a male, this is how you can tell the sexes apart. If you flip them over near their vent and you see these little spurs, and it's a boy. No spurs, it's a girl. I would say, generally speaking, females are bigger than males. Yeah, pretty much all the time. There's a couple good pictures here. Their underside, again, kind of that creamy yellow underside, which is similar to the racer. So it can be, it's potential to confuse these two. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Oh, and here's a great shot of head and tail. Same basic shape. There's a reason for that. here's a series, let's see. Oh yeah, we'll talk about that here. Okay, so why are the head and tail the same? Well, there's a couple different theories and or reasons. I don't know how well documented this is, but a couple prevailing theories are as follows. One, when you disturb a boa, oftentimes it'll do this. It'll ball up and its head will disappear, but its tail will be out. So if you're a predator, you know, when you're going for that head, because that's the bitey end, and you want to neutralize it, and it's the tail you grab onto, that's a lot less risk for the snake. That's one reason. So you notice that tail in this picture has a lot of scarring. That's one reason why it might have scarring. But I think the more likely reason is because of their feeding strategies. It's thought that what they do is they go down into a mouse or rodent burrow, and particularly if it's like a mom with babies, and they readily eat baby mice, as you just saw, they're going after that nest of babies. Well, mom's going to defend the nest. But if they put the tail up for mom to go after, then they can sneak around and just munch babies while she attacks the tail. And I hardly ever, if ever, have found a boa without a scar on its tail. And they also, I mentioned they feed on shrews, and shrews are fierce little predators. They're like the hummingbirds of the mammal world in terms of their energy needs. They gotta just eat like every 15 minutes. And so I imagine going after a shrew is not an easy task. You know, they're gonna fight back. And so I suspect that maybe if they're preying on shrews, they use that same kind of thing. Maybe shrew goes for the tail, and then the snake just grabs the shrew, and then it's all over. In any case, you often, if not almost always, will find scars on their tails, oops, like that, and oftentimes you'll even see them on the body. So sometimes maybe the tail defense didn't fool the mother mouse, and so you got little bite marks all over. Boas, unless they're pretty small and they're still feeding on insects, and once they advance to where they're feeding on mammals, they pretty much always have scars. So that's a cool fact. So, cool snake, where do you find them? Like I say, they're the easiest and in many ways kind of the most pleasing snake to handle. You know, anywhere where you got kind of a mix of shade and sun with good ground litter. Upper Chewuk River, Twist River Trail, or Twist River Road in general, but probably on the trail too, and the Winthrop Trail between Patterson Lake and Tinytown.
So many.
Yes, that is my, when I need a boa for a talk, and I live on that trail, I just ride my bike or hike up and down until I find one. Again, if I go out late in the day, dusk, chances are good. In fact, if you ride the Winthrop Trail on your bike, anytime during the middle of summer, pay attention as you're going up and you're going slow because it's a grueling climb. Watch how many snake trails go across that trail in the dust, of all sizes. I don't know what my record count is, but there's sometimes when I'll be going up there and I'll see 6, 8, 10, 12 different snake trails. Probably 3 or 4 different species.
A small tidbit was we found several burned up after the fire, right on the surface.
Wow, interesting.
About 3.
That's interesting because, like I say, these are fairly fossorial. You know, they're often down into burrows and whatnot, but sometimes they're just under the litter, under the bark, under the leaf buildup. And if they were doing that, then they were toast in the fire, literally. Question? Take some question. Again, super easy to handle. They're slow, so they're easy to catch. Unlike racers, these look a lot like a racer, but like behavior's totally different. So these guys are the easiest thing to catch. Racers are the most difficult. So never bite. You know, there's always an exception to every rule. The only 2 people I know who claim to have been bitten by a rubber boa are my wife and my daughter. I don't know what they're doing to these snakes to make them bite, because they've never bitten me, and that's the general rule of thumb. And even if they do, they have such tiny little mouths and teeth, they're not going to hurt you. They poop, I would say boas, half the time. It's not as stinky as a garter snake. Garter snakes and racers just really stink. You know, they're just really charismatic. They're the best snake to get people over their fear of snakes. I mean, they're harmless, they're really cool to touch, you know, they're not aggressive. They make great living jewelry, fabulous little creatures. Love handling boas. I never, like if I'm out on my bike or driving, there's a boa on the road, I am always going to stop and pick it up. There's just no way around it.
Is it illegal to keep one as a pet?
I You know, technically, probably no one's going to care, but boas are hard keepers. Sometimes it's really hard to get them to eat. Versus, say, gopher snake, no problem. They'll eat whatever mouse you throw in front of them. Yep.
Forms, when their body is curved, the skin is bunched up, like there's wrinkles. I don't see that on other snakes. What is stopping that?
That's a really good question.
What was the question?
You know, when you see a boa and it's like kind of curved or coiled a little bit and its skin will kind of bunch or wrinkle up there, why is that? And she's right. You see them like that a lot. And you don't see that with other snakes. And part of it maybe is because of the tiny little scales. So the skin's super flexible. I don't know, maybe it's just something about boas. You know, they have that rounder, a little bit heavier body makeup, and they're a constrictor. Maybe it's something to do with that too. I think the small scales are part of it. Well, this is the same when people, you know, when you're going to talk about snakes, everybody I think tends to automatically think about rattlesnakes. So we're going to touch on these, on these just like I did on the other species, but I don't want to steal a bunch of John's thunder, so we'll go through this fairly quickly. John's going to go into depth on these guys, and they're super fascinating. I believe evolutionarily, these are considered the most advanced snake. You know, that weaponry, those fangs, we'll see that in the next slide. So, shrub steppe and dry forest, but higher than you might think, because these guys will, even though they tend to den at lower elevations, they will move up in the summer. I almost stepped on one of these up in the Black Pine Basin at about 5,000 feet once. You know, I'm up in the spruce fir zone almost, so I'm not thinking about rattlesnakes. And look down, it's like, whoa, they're just coiled sitting. So if you're someplace where it's not too far downhill, at least in a direct line to where you know is a kind of a snaky part of the valley, there could be snakes higher than you think. But they're limited by denning habitat. So we were talking about, you know, why aren't there rattlesnakes, or if there's gopher snakes there, does that mean there won't be rattlesnakes? No. The places that don't have rattlesnakes are places that don't have good denning habitat. Or that maybe had limiting denning habitat, but people knew about the dens and persecuted the snakes until they were gone and they haven't recolonized. Those would be the two reasons why the snakes don't occur there. Either denning habitat didn't exist, or they got extirpated locally from that den.
What makes the good denning?
Good denning habitat is a rocky environment, typically, that has openings in the surface that allow the snake to get down below the frost line and have enough of a cavity underneath, typically where multiple snakes can communally den. Yep.
Don't the other snakes all den?
They do, but like a lot of them will den individually, sometimes in a deep burrow. And the other snakes are much more variable. So boas supposedly will sometimes communally den, although no one I know has ever found a communal den boa locally, or communal boa den. Like I say, we've seen racers at rattlesnake dens fairly frequently. Occasionally, gopher snake, once in a while a garter snake. Garter snakes, maybe I forgot to mention, well no, I did mention. So they form the most massive communal dens in some cases. Garter snakes do typically den communally. But for whatever reason, maybe it's something to do with their need to bask, rattlesnakes' choices are more limited. And they're larger snakes. So if you're a garter snake, you can get by with a smaller opening, probably got more places to pick from. If you're bigger, your requirements are a little bit more specialized, less opportunity perhaps. In any case, that seems to be, from what we can tell, that's what drives distribution is denning habitat. There are only venomous snake, and that's technically not true. We talked about some rear-fanged snakes. This is the only one that's dangerous for us. They're large, heavy-bodied. These are our heaviest snakes. And I'm going to show you a picture of one in a minute. That was the heaviest one we've caught to date. The longest ones we've ever caught are around the 4-foot mark. You go farther south, a little bit more climate, they probably get a little bigger. They, brown to greenish, with the dark dorsal blotching. So we've seen a couple of other blotchy snakes. We'll talk about this again in a second in terms of ID. Banded tail, towards the tip of the tail. This picture is pretty good. It tends to be white and dark bands. So there's just a diagram of the weaponry, kind of the advanced evolutionary development of venom delivery. I'm not going to say much about that because I know John's going to go into that at length. And they subdue their prey with venom. Mostly small mammals. Warm-blooded things are their preferred prey, and John will talk about that more. I'll mention it again here briefly. Great rodent control. These guys, again, we talk about them being emphasized 5,000 feet. They are viviparous, live young. Cool facts. I'm only going to touch again on this a little bit. They can see in the dark. And what I mean by that is they can sense infrared heat with these pits below their nostrils. John will fill you in on the details. They do den communally. Talked about that a minute ago. There's this pile of snakes there. That's somewhat staged. That technically is a den entrance, believe it or not, through those needles. These are a whole bunch of snakes we caught that we were tagging. Then when we got done doing all the measurements and marking, we had to take them back to the den. We thought, wait a minute, we're going to dump out this whole bucket of snakes. We got to take some pictures. So, so here's a den video. This is a typical den. See that pile?
So that's like spring as they're coming out?
Yeah. You know, they're coming out to the entrance to bask, and then when the sun goes down, they go back in. They'll stay at the den entrance for a while there until the days warm up enough. They can
Say that
safely
again.
yeah. Let's see. We have to go back. Now we can play again. It'll start in 3 seconds. There's a GoPro on the end of my snake stick. There's quite a few snakes there. I want to say we counted like 30 some that day. No worries, because there's a bonus video. This is the pile of snakes I just talked about. There's little ones, there's big ones, green ones, brown ones.
When you do work on them, are they just in the tubes the whole time?
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah. Yeah, if we're actually handling them, they're in a tube. Or they're in a bag. Yeah. I mean, I have free-handed a rattlesnake on a couple of occasions. I don't recommend it. I generally don't do it. It's not worth the risk. If you don't have some underlying health issue, a bite from one of these is unlikely to kill you, very unlikely to kill you, but it's going to ruin your day and your week, and it's going to be very expensive, so you don't want to get bit by one.
What does the venom do?
It's a hemotoxic venom. This species in particular is mostly hemotoxin, so it breaks down tissue. Like the capillaries basically explode. You get a lot of internal bleeding and necrotic tissue, and it's not good.
You had 2 questions over there.
Yep. Sorry, just speak up if you have a question.
Okay. I've heard of timber rattlers, and I've never known whether they're really something different or just a short.
Good question, because you're right. A lot of people refer to timber rattlers. Timber rattlesnake is actually a specific species of rattlesnake, and it's found in the eastern and southern U.S. John knows a lot about timber rattlesnakes, actually. He's read a lot of books. He even spent time in the field with a guy who had worked on them, I think. So remember that question and ask him when he's here.
So probably what?
But locally, all our snakes are Northern Pacific. It's the only one we've got. Yep. Yep.
Are snakes hibernating in a den or living in a den for warmth, or is there a social element to it what is the purpose of denning?
Good question. So the question is, what's the purpose of denning? Social, body warmth, what are they doing? I would say there's 2 things. With rattlesnakes in particular, I'd say it's primarily 2 things. They're there to avoid freezing. get below frost line, stay unfrozen during winter. That's the primary reason for hibernating in a den, below the surface. But there are social aspects. So we talked about the garter snakes. As soon as they emerge from that giant den in Manitoba, it's mating season, and you get these mating balls with all these males chasing females. Pretty spectacular to watch from a behavioral standpoint. And with rattlesnakes, I think they're not necessarily mating right off the bat, but the fact that they're using the same den means, those males are going to be able to scent trail females as they leave when they're ready for mating. So there is some social element to it as well. But no, they're not getting body warmth, because remember they're ectotherms, they're not generating their own heat.
Do they have preferred feeding areas? Like I have seen.
Yes.
I have seen them come from various directions to dens.
Yes.
I assume that they're.
I would say we have enough evidence to answer that question in the affirmative. What he's asking is, do they have preferred feeding sites? And oftentimes when you, like researchers that have caught rattlesnakes and radioed them at their work, it's midsummer. And especially rattlesnakes, they're like a sit and wait critter. So they can just be sitting there waiting for a mouse to come by. If you catch them and move them, they'll tend to come right back to where you caught them. So I think the answer is yes. Oops. Oh, well, we'll watch it again later.
It's cool.
That noise, it's not real loud here. I've had this connected to speakers before, where you can visibly see people in the audience jump when that video starts. It's like ingrained. Yep.
Has anybody studied which snakes are together? Are they families that stay together, or do young disperse? Does anybody know?
That's a really good question. Ask John that 2 weeks from now.
Okay.
I bet he's got some insight. I don't know the answer off the top. I have some suspicions, but I don't know the answer.
When I moved here, I was told there's more snakes on the north side of the valley than the south side of the valley. So I used that to get my wife to go hiking on the south side.
Use whatever it takes to get your wife to go hiking. That's good. But I wouldn't, and I don't mean that in a sexist. It could be the other way around. It could be, frankly, it would be more often to try to get the husband to go hiking. But what was I going to say? It's not so much north side of the valley as it is south-facing slope. That's the key. Yeah.
But what about the west side of the Methow River? Are there more rare than the side of rattlesnakes there?
Lots of snakes on the west side of the Chihuahua. So we're going to talk about that a little bit right now. I need to skip one now. Okay. So viewing, where do you find these? Good questions. Are they on the north side or the south side of the valley, or the west side of the Chihuahua, or the east side? Well, they're where you got south-facing rocky areas that get a fair amount of sun for basking, and usually where there's some rocks or there's denning habitat. Those are kind of the two criteria. So if you're going to go look for these, everybody, I think, who's been to the valley any length of time knows that Pipestone Canyon's a pretty snaky place. Probably not as much as it was 10 years ago for two reasons. The largest den, and when I say largest, I mean with the most snakes that John and I had ever worked at, was in Pipestone, and there were a couple of years where we were unsure if it was human persecution or natural predation or both, but the den, it's almost completely devoid of snakes. It's now starting to reclaim itself a little bit. We've actually turned a few out there. It's on a wildlife area, so it's a good place for us to release and do some snakes. But Pipestone in general is still snaky. The fire probably took out a fair number. Those really fast-moving hot fires are tough on critters like this. But if you want to go look for these, Rendezvous, southern half of the Rendezvous Gun Ranch, great place to find rattlesnakes. That's where you go on snake day, usually find several. Finley Canyon, Golden Toe, portion of the wildlife area, very snaky place. Handling, just don't. There's no need. Look, take photos, but don't handle if you don't have to. If you do, use tongs. They don't seek you out to bite you. And this species in particular is not very aggressive unless you step on one. They're not going to bite you. Yep.
You might suggest that if people go to any of these areas, they don't take their dogs.
Oh, really good. Yep.
One of our friends was hiking on the
Yep.
Golden Doe, and the dog got bitten by a rattlesnake.
Good advice. Yeah, dogs, every year we get dog bites in the valley, probably several, I would say, or at least a few annually. Yeah, dogs, they're covering about 5 times as much ground as you are when you're out there, so their odds of running into a snake are better. Plus, they just, they hear it, or they see the movement, they get too close, snake feels threatened. Snake's not going to bite unless it feels threatened. But, your dog can make it feel threatened, and hence the bite.
Does it kill the dog?
Dogs tend to be fairly, they usually weather the bites pretty well, but it can kill a dog. Yep. 10 minutes, thanks. Oh, that's perfect, basically. Yep.
Ken, our friend's dog, they had to carry the dog out and then had treatment at the vet, and the dog didn't recover.
How big was the dog?
A small border collie.
Yeah. So the bigger the dog, it's kind of a body mass thing. The venom dose is going to be harder on a smaller dog. Cats, don't know. Cats don't run into rattlesnakes as much as dogs. Cats are smarter, yeah. I would guess a cat would be in trouble because they're small. Again, it's a body mass thing. The same dose of venom in an 80-pound German Shepherd is going to be hard on a 15-pound cat. What was I going to tell you? Oh, yeah, this picture. I wanted to point something out real quick before I forget, and then I'll answer your question. This snake that I'm holding here, this is Smog. We named him Smog. If you're a Lord of the Rings fan or The Hobbit. That's the heaviest snake we've ever caught. He was about 4 feet long, and he weighed, John will know exactly, I'll bet you, but I want to say like 1.2 kilograms, something like that. So, pushing 5 pounds, yeah.
So on the game
Yep.
range, are people allowed to hunt or shoot snakes?
Yeah, technically it is illegal.
So that people could have gone in there and
Yes.
decimated.
Something had been digging at that den. It didn't, I've seen dens that people have persecuted. This looked a little different. I was thinking maybe a badger was partly responsible. I have no idea.
I live in the canyon.
Oh, do you?
After the fire, I didn't see any snakes for 2 years.
Yeah, yeah.
It was pretty well decimated.
No, I mean that time, so that was what, July, the snakes are well away from the den, they're exposed, even summer, they're not necessarily getting under anything at night, it's not getting that cold, they're really vulnerable to a fire like that. One interesting anecdote related to that, somebody who lived farther south was a little like oasis of green after the fire, and like within a week, like 20 rattlesnakes showed up in the yard, because it was like the only green spot left. So, if you go out, and you decide you want to catch these, that's not the best attire. No, don't do that. Wear boots, wear long pants. So real quickly, we talked about what snakes we know of, and lizards are here for sure. There's a couple that John and I are really curious about, and suspect they occur in the Methow, just haven't documented. Night snake that Dan brought. We've alluded to a little bit. It's kind of tricky because it looks so much like our gopher and rattlesnake. Same general pattern, brown on brown, dark blotches, light background. A couple of things to look for though, small size. I mean, the one we caught was maybe 12 inches long over in the Okanagan Valley. They rarely are above 18 inches long. And dark head. It's got that darker head, that's kind of a clue. Vertical eye pupil too. Rattlesnakes and these guys have a vertical eye pupil. If you get close enough to see that anyway, that'll help. Sage-breasted lizard looks like almost identical to a fence lizard, so they're tough to tell apart. As I pointed out in that one slide, there's no blue underneath there's no blue chin patch on a male. The females are more difficult. Apparently, and I haven't looked close enough to really be an expert on this by any stretch, but the back side of the thigh doesn't have the rough-keeled scales. On a fence lizard, it does. So you got to get one of these in hand, which is challenging enough to begin with. And then look at that tiny little spot. They're pretty small. Snout to vent is up to 2.5 inches max, probably. But anyway, if you think you see one of these things, try to get a picture. Let me know. I'd love to document this in the Methow. In terms of where to find these guys, if I were looking for night snakes, I would be in the lower third of the valley, in the rocky areas, arid rocky. I'd be flipping rocks, canyons. But if you've seen rattlesnakes there, that's a good starting point. Lizards, if you see them, especially skinks, that'd be a good place to look. These are, again, epistoglyphs, rear-fanged, but they're not dangerous to people. Oviparous, lay eggs. Sagebrush lizard, unlike the fence lizard, you're probably not going to see these in the trees. They're going to be in arid, open areas with typically loose soil, like sandy or loamy soil. So one place I know they occur in the Okanagan Valley is that stretch like south of, between Okanagan and Brewster, where you got that sandy environment on either side of the road. I know they occur there. So again, I would be looking in the lower Methow, places with loose soil, if I really wanted to find one.
What is it on in that right picture? What is it?
Oh, so, and I thank you, because I meant to point out, so these guys, in this state anyway, are pretty low elevation critters, shrub steppe, out in the dry lowlands. These two pictures, I took these pictures, but they're from Yellowstone National Park, at about 7,700 feet in the Geyser Basin off the east end of Shoshone Lake. And I think it's because those geyser basins have their own little microclimate, where it's warm and the snow doesn't accumulate, and these guys were there. And when I saw these things, I thought, what the heck, fence lizards? Maybe. And finally, when I went to the park, I think I went to one of the visitor centers and said, okay, what's up with these lizards? And it turns out they're sagebrush lizards, which is really weird. The one on the right is a little, like a neonate, little baby one, and the other one's full-grown adult who lost part of his tail. And no, I did not break it off.
Would that be a regrowing tail?
Yes, it was regrowing. Yeah, the end was already healed over, it was regrowing. All right, so I made a point of talking about egg laying versus live young. So this slide illustrates on the left are our oviparous critters, and on the right are our viviparous critters. And with one possible exception being the skink, these are the critters we see out in colder temperatures, at higher altitudes, in more forested environments, versus these guys that are out in the open. And I think it's because if you're incubating, you're young inside, maybe you have a little more flexibility in terms of where you can be. But if you've got to rely on Mother Nature and sun exposure to incubate your eggs, then you better be at lower elevation and more open country. So I think that's one of the reasons we have the two strategies. A couple of quick ID slides. So when you're out in the field and you see a garter snake and you're like, dang, which one is it? Pronounced stripe, common. Less distinct, western terrestrial or wandering. That's the quick and dirty. You can, technically, if you want, you can grab a snake, get pooped on, maybe get bit, count the labial scales, which are the lip scales, and then look up in your field guide, okay, which one has 7, which one has 8, just look for the stripe. That's what it is. Tough snake IDs. Okay, so this one, at least superficially, is maybe, I would say, the second most difficult, because they do, at a quick glance, they look pretty similar. Basic colors about the same, but snake on the left, the racer is way fast. Snake on the right is going to be moving slowly, guaranteed. And that big black eye, you see the big black eye? It's a racer. What was that little tiny eyes, and why would that be? Fossorial, under the ground a lot. Who needs to see when you're under the leaf litter or down a road in burrow? You're using your tongue more than your eyes. Gopher versus rattler. This is the toughest, I think, for a lot of people, and because your adrenaline's flowing, and so you really got to kind of stop, look, and because gopher snakes evolved to mimic rattlesnakes, so there's a reason they look so similar. Smaller, narrower head. Look at how wide that head is. Venom gland, venom gland. That's why they have wide triangular heads, because they got to have space for those venom glands. Gopher snake will flatten his head and try to look like that, but like in this photo, he's got a smaller head. They both tend to have banding on the tails, but you don't always get to see the tail. In this case, you actually can see the rattle right there. A lot of times, though, you might not, if the snake's not coiled and it's moving, you may not get a good look at the rattle. So one thing I've noticed, rattlesnakes will have this nice kind of horizontal eye marring, whereas the gopher snake has a small vertical one typically. And I gotta look at like all my photos to see, I'm pretty sure that's consistent throughout. So if you can't see the rattle, there's some other tips for differentiating. Okay, so quiz done. How about that one?
Rattlesnake.
Yeah, that's a baby rattlesnake. They tend to, skipped ahead. They tend to be gray when they're young, and so people sometimes get confused. And sometimes it's like a really bright gray, and the blotches are almost like a burnt sienna, red-brown color. And so people are like, well, what's that? Well, it's still a rattlesnake. It's still got that wide head, horizontal eye stripe. It may just have a button on the tail, which will be very hard to see, so you may not be able to use that characteristic. How about this one? You guys are good. Yeah, but that's got blotches. How can that be a razor? It's a baby one, yeah. Juvenile racers have little blotches, like many of our other snakes. Probably kind of a camouflage thing. Not entirely sure, but big black eye, long, skinny, pointy tail. All right, we kind of already covered this, snake handling tips. I encourage people to handle the non-venomous ones. They're really fun. Move slow, be gentle, that's kind of self-explanatory. Support the weight of the snake. You wouldn't want somebody to hold you up by one arm, so give them some support. Move with the scales, don't run your hand counter to the scales. And yeah, wash your hands after, especially if you get pooped on. But enjoy it. I mean, snakes are fun. They're just really cool. All right, and be snake aware. And this is sort of my soapbox plea. It's like, to please, if you can avoid it, don't run them over. Because so many that's their biggest source of mortality, is cars. Yeah, it's bikes too, although being run over by a bike isn't necessarily fatal, but a car almost always is. But one last fun video. This is Winthrop Trail near Sun Mountain Cabins.
That very spot, I ran under a door. I just clipped it.
Whoa! I know, this was not staged.
Good set.
Like I said, if I have a chance to pick up a boa, I take it. But yeah, if you want to see them, spend some time on the Winthrop Trail. Sooner or later, you will see a boa. Alrighty, are we done?
How long do you have?
3 minutes.
Okay.
I just want to mention a couple of things real quick because they're sort of developing issues that you might hear more about. And apparently your amphibian person is going to talk about disease. So on the reptile side of things, a couple of disease issues to take note of. There's a thing called snake fungal disease that's moving through several species in the eastern part of the country. And it's slowly advancing west, and those of us in the biological community are kind of trying to monitor and track that. So when we go out on Snake Day this year, we're going to, assuming I can get our vet out here, we're going to take samples from every snake, sort of a baseline. I've never seen a snake that I thought had this, and it's not been documented in Washington, but we want to get some baseline data.
What does it look like?
It's just, I didn't have time to dig up some pictures. It's kind of like necrotic tissue on parts of the snake, sores, open sores, that kind of thing. Pond turtles, western pond turtles, or other native turtle species in Washington have a similar issue with their shells. And I don't know much about this at all. All I know is it is an issue, both in the captively reared animals that they release at some of these sites and in the wild population as well. Invasives are a problem also for pond turtles. Bullfrogs eat young turtles. And When you talk about amphibians next week, I'm guessing there will be some discussion about bullfrogs and their effect on other native amphibians like leopard frogs. Bullfrogs are one of the primary reasons these guys are almost extinct in Washington. That's a leopard frog from Zion National Park, actually, but it looks very similar to the ones we have here. Or used to, at least. I don't know that these ever occurred in Oakland County, but the basin, they used to be much more widespread. That's it. Happy to answer any more questions either now or come up to me afterwards. No, it's...
Is snake day part of this course?
Yeah, May 12th. Yeah, so it's in your syllabus, and I was just going to say, also in your syllabus, I put Western. Yeah, so there's some Western pond turtle stuff in your syllabus on this class. So specifically the most recent conservation bulletin that WDFW has put out. Because, yeah, there's captive breeding programs. I mean, they're trying to save this turtle because
That's
of
the
these.
other turtle in the state.
It's the other native turtle species, yep.
Western.
Western pond.
So if you go to Woodland Park Zoo at any point, like that's one of the main places that is actually trying to breed the turtles, and then state biologists, they work with people all throughout the state to disperse them, but the zoo is actually breeding them.
Captive breeding is a wonderful tool. There's many examples in the course of the last 20 or 30 years where it's been a really successful tools to use. But in this case, there's some question as to whether or not the turtle, the shell disease, has come from the captive.
Oh, interesting.
Or is exacerbated by, so double-edged sword sometimes. Yes, Scott?
The comment was made earlier about not finding rattlesnakes south of the Methow. Is there any kind of general situation where rattlesnakes have been extirpated, practically speaking, from large parts of the valley?
I don't know about large parts, and it's hard to know because we don't have any baseline data per se, anything that's comprehensive. John would be a much better person to answer that question because he knows the literature a little better. I mean, there were dens down near the mouth of the Columbia and Herpetology that have thousands of snakes at one time that don't have anywhere near that many currently. But in terms of extirpation, I'm guessing there are some localized sites that we probably don't know about because by the time anybody was paying attention, they were gone. But south